During the Middle Ages, the most influential group in all of Western Europe was the Roman Catholic Church. Each community was centered around a church. Some of the different functions of the church were to provide your traditional religious services, Sunday Mass, but they also were actually the medical professionals for the community. Many of them monks, nuns, and priests would care for the poor or sick, and they also would be the host of many of the entertainment things in the community, the festivals. Some of the larger towns would have these grand cathedrals, and these would be donated by people with a lot of money, and they would donate money to help build the cathedral as a symbol of their faith. One of the most famous examples is the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which took over 200 years to build. These grand cathedrals were built in the Gothic style of architecture, which focused on having these tall pointed ceilings which would point towards heaven, tall towers, often with a bell tower to call people to prayer and to church, and they would be made in the shape of the cross, the symbol of the Christian faith. They also would contain stained glass windows, which would tell stories to those who couldn't read from the Bible. One of the most important things that could happen in a bad way was an excommunication. If you did something that made the church displeased with you, they would excommunicate you, which literally meant no communication. And what this meant was that some of the most important sacraments or life events that would happen in the church, such as baptism, marriage, or burial, would not take place, and it also meant that a person's soul could not get into heaven. So you definitely did not want to make the church upset with you, because that could lead to excommunication, which meant that you couldn't get into heaven and your soul would go to either hell or purgatory, neither of which were a place you wanted your soul to go to. Here are some examples of Gothic architecture. The pointer is pointing to Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which is one of the most famous examples of Gothic architecture. You can see here the long portion here is the body of the cross, and then here it goes across, and that was the base. These cathedrals also had, as mentioned before, the high pointed ceilings, which were supposed to give a person this concept of going up towards heaven, so that they would live a life focusing on the ideals of the church. And so when you were in that space, not only were you hearing about the different stories from the Bible and hearing about God and Christianity, but you had this sense that would of going to heaven and how you should live your life. There were two groups of people in the church who had an influential part of kind of continuing education in the community and also other roles. One were the men who were called monks, and these were Christian men who devoted their life to prayer. They studied and copied manuscripts and kept past knowledge alive. Most of the time during the Middle Ages, the majority of people, even people who were high-ranking officials in the government, did not have the ability to read and write. These monks, however, did know how to read and write, and their job was to rewrite each of these books. There are no printers or typewriters or computers at this time, and so the only way to recreate a book is to rewrite it by hand. So down here you see a picture of a monk in something called a scriptorium rewriting the passage. They lived a very secluded and private life, but would provide some services to the communities. And they lived in these private communities called monasteries. The female version of a monk was called a nun, and these were Christian women who devoted their lives to prayer as well. They also did other services for the community. They had the skill of knowing how to sew. They often were teachers in the community. They would care for the poor, and sometimes they also, like the male version, the monks, would copy manuscripts as well, and they lived in a secluded community called a convent. One of the most important events in the life of the Catholic Church during this time were a series of 4 wars called the Crusades, or the War of the Cross. They were a series of military expeditions that took place with Western European Christian soldiers traveling from Western Europe, primarily France, and many from England as well, in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and they would travel to the Holy Land, which is modern-day Israel. The religion we learned about in our religions unit called Islam had begun in the year 600, in the 600s, And they had spread throughout the Holy Land, which is where Judaism had begun and also where Christianity had begun. And Islam had begun nearby and had conquered the Middle Eastern area. And so these Christians felt that this land should have been remaining in Christian hands, and so they traveled there to try and basically fight a war and kick the people out. The results of this: Muslims were not driven from the Holy Land. The Crusades were highly unsuccessful in terms of trying to conquer the land and remove Islam from this region. Even in modern times today, in 2015, Islam is still the primary religion in this region. But what it did do is it began to open up travel and trade routes from Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East, into North Africa. As mentioned earlier in our lectures, during the Middle Ages, there wasn't a lot of travel and trade, and the Crusades are actually going to reopen that and allow people to start to see the world outside of their small little villages in Western Europe. And so as a result of this is going to be a lot of cultural diffusion and also religion spread. Islam will spread, but Christianity will also spread as well. So it has it spreads in both directions.